Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to the fifth session of this spring's Education Policy Colloquium series, sponsored by the Program on Education Policy and Governance here at Kane School. My name is Jim Pizer, and I'm pleased to be your host, working with the PEPG team, in particular in collaboration with its leaders, Paul Peterson and Marty West. As most of you know, we meet every Thursday here at the Kennedy School through at noon, generally speaking, almost always, I guess, through April. We get together to discuss the latest developments in research and education policy. The one exception to that schedule is next week. Harvard's on vacation, so we won't be meeting next week. We'll be here in 2 weeks, which is March 27th, when our speaker will be Ludger Wussmann or Wussmann. Yeah, I got it, or Grusman. I'm not sure what how my German is or how he likes it pronounced, but nonetheless, he's going to be here anyway. Dr. Wussmann is one of the world's leading economists working in the field of education. Serves as director of the Center for the Economics of Education at the Institute for Economic Research in Germany. So make sure you come back, not next week, but 2 weeks from now, to hear Ludger. Today's session features an education economist a little bit closer to home, and I would also argue a world leader of equal stature, namely Hugsy Professor Tom Kane, who will be talking to us about pandemic recovery, which is actually about learning post-COVID as opposed to healthcare, I think. Is that fair?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
We're in the right room. Tom is the founder and faculty director of the Center for Education Policy and Research here at Harvard. And he and his team have been the go-to resource for tracking learning outcomes at the state and community level across the country through their education recovery scorecard, which you're going to be hearing more about in a few minutes. I don't want to give away the punchline, but suffice it to say that we've still got a lot of work to do. And given the recent events in Washington, this analysis couldn't be more timely, since the role of the federal government in all of this seems to be up for grabs. Although things are politically a bit calmer here on the home front in Massachusetts, the scorecard's data on reading and math achievement, on chronic absenteeism, and on the unequal rate of recovery between low income and higher income communities and districts is troubling, to say the least. After Tom's presentation, we should have ample time for questions and answers and discussion. We'll give priority to folks who are here in the room, but we've got folks zooming in online, so I will try to coordinate with Michael to work them into the conversation as we go along. For all of you who are actually calling in, please make sure to sort of enter into the chat your questions or comments, and we'll try to integrate them into the conversation. And for everyone on Zoom as well as here in the room, this is being recorded. It'll be posted online. It'll be available on the website for folks who aren't here, but for anyone who wants to see it, relive it all again. But that is to say that this is on the record, and so keep that in mind as we're having our conversation. And with that, it's a privilege to turn it over to Tom Kane. Tom, it's all yours.
Thanks. So the work I'm going to be talking about today is joint work with Sean Reardon at Stanford and Doug Steger at Dartmouth College. So we started the Education Recovery Scorecard back in 2022 for the simple reason that we knew the NAEP was going to be reporting out state level changes in achievement following the pandemic. But we also knew, based on some other work that we've done, that the story likely varied a lot by district within state, and there were no efforts underway to try to measure that. And so we teamed up to be able to report out district by district what was the change over time in achievement. And we're doing this for two reasons. 1 second. Okay. So first, before I get into the reasons, just the data that we're doing, we've got 43 states. We're missing a few states because of low participation rates in those states. We needed to be able to assume that the population of students taking the NAEP were the same as the population of students taking the state test. And so in a few states that had high opt-out rates, we weren't able, so we had a minimum participation rate of 94%. In a few states that had participation rates lower than that, we've excluded them from this. We lost a few other states for other reasons, but we've got 43 of 51 states. Why this is important is previously the NAEP only reported district level data for about 26 districts that were part of the TUDA assessments. But other than that, there was no way to track district level changes unless you were one of
the TUDA districts. You might say, gosh, don't we have state tests? Yes, but
Sorry, 1 second.
sorry.
Yep. Go ahead.
But the issue with the state tests is they're constantly changing proficiency definitions. So here are just 4 examples. In Illinois, in reading back in around 2015, there was a big change in the state standards. You can see that because the red line is the percent proficient on the state test. The green line is basically the changing in NAEP scores converted into grade equivalents. You can see the green line actually saw a small increase from 2014 to 2015 in Illinois, even though there was a huge decline in proficiency. There was a redefinition of proficiency in Illinois in that year. Same thing happened in Maryland, in math, in Florida. Around that same period, there was a redefinition of proficiency, but then there was also a redefinition of proficiency in reading again in 2023. Florida and math, similar thing. And even in some states, there are unofficial changes in proficiency where the state says their proficiency rate has not changed, but there's a very different trend on the state test versus what's happening in the NAEP. So if you were an individual district, say in Florida in 2024, and you're just asking, are we back above where we were in 2019? Is our achievement, have we been trending up or down? It would be impossible for you to say because the state has changed the proficiency definition in a way that makes that impossible to answer. So that's one of the reasons why we created this, was to use the NAEP to put the state tests on the same scale and then report out district by district what the trend in achievement has been. A second reason we're doing this is just that the public agencies that we count on to educate our children aren't always forthcoming when there are problems. So here's the trend in achievement in Lynn, Massachusetts. In Lynn, I'm sure it's hard for you to read back there, but between the peak in 2015 and now, there's been a more than 2 grade equivalent loss in math achievement in Lynn. In reading performance, relative to the peak in 2017, there's also been about a 2 grade equivalent loss in Lynn. But then if you look at Lynn's press release, when the NAEP results came out, when the MCAS results came out, this highlighting is mine, but you would find nowhere in this press release mention of the fact that we're down 2 grade equivalents relative to where we were in 2015. In fact, just the opposite. 12 of our schools increased overall percentile ranking. And these schools, and 3 schools exited from the requiring assistance classification. The highlighted results are improved performance in science, no mention of math or reading, relative gains for students with 504 plans. So part of the reason why the results that we were putting out have gotten attention in local communities is that they run so counter to the stories that that residents have been told with what's happening. Okay, so if you're interested, the results are reported on a website. This is just a screenshot of the Education Recovery Scorecard website where we have the report and case studies of a number of communities that have recovered prior to above their 2019 levels of achievement. So in this week, there's also a research report where we took the individual district level data for these 8,700 districts, and we try to ask, what were some of the factors related to recovery between 22 and 24? What role is chronic absenteeism playing? What role did the federal dollars, the federal pandemic relief dollars, which expired in September, what role did they play? So first of all, as we document and others have shown, there was a large increase in absenteeism. There was, in fact, the share of students that were considered chronically absent, and that chronic absenteeism is defined as missing 10% or more of the school year, essentially doubled from 2019 to 2022. Now, it turns out the absence rate did not double to be able to produce that increase in chronic absence rates. The absence rates increased from about 6% to about 8%. So an increase in absences, but not the doubling that the chronic absenteeism number conjures up. The increases were larger in higher poverty districts. So the richest districts, so less than 20% free reduced price lunch, had about an 8 percentage point increase in chronic absenteeism. The higher poverty districts saw about a 20% increase in chronic absenteeism. So I presented in this seminar a couple of years ago on just what were the effects of the school closures on student achievement, and we found that high poverty schools were more likely to be closed for longer or during the recovery. This is sort of adding to that the increase, everybody saw an increase in absenteeism, but the increases in absenteeism were higher in the higher poverty communities. So it's not everybody's missing school, but the rate of missing school disproportionately hit the higher poverty communities. So I don't want to drag you guys through a bunch of regression results. So why don't I'll just summarize what these tables are showing. If you're interested, you can see the report. But one of the things that we just ask is, okay, how much was this increase in absenteeism related to the school closures? Like, so can we point to the school closures as one of the causes of the rise in absenteeism? Like I often joke that I really hate taking sick days. I can't remember the last sick day I took. And the reason is I don't want to know how nice it is not to be at work. And so one hypothesis is that as kids got used to being out of school, maybe that is related to some of the increase in absenteeism. We saw some evidence of that schools that were closed for longer during 2021 saw somewhat higher absences rates, but nowhere near, you could explain about a 3 percentage point increase in absence going from 0 to 100% remote during the 2021 school year, when there was a 13-point increase overall. So it was part of it. But the increases in absenteeism happened in places that had come back to school immediately in the fall of 2022. So there was a relationship, but it wasn't the main story. The second thing and I'll tell you in a minute here, I was just talking about what caused the rise in absenteeism. I'll talk in a minute about what were the impacts of absenteeism on recovery. But before I do that, I also want to point to the second question that we were trying to ask is, what role did the federal dollars play in helping districts recover? And one of the things that makes that a hard question to answer, you might think, gosh, like, can't you just look at the correlation between the amount of aid that you got and the magnitude of the recovery? Well, actually, no, it's not that simple. And the reason is that the aid dollars weren't distributed randomly. In fact, they were distributed on the basis of the Title I formula, which is based on district poverty. So poorer districts received a lot more federal aid. And so if you just look at the relationship between aid and recovery, you might be measuring the effect of poverty, not the effect of the aid. So what we're doing is we're trying to sort out what was the effect of aid over and above poverty. And the way we're able to do that is that it turns out there was a tremendous amount of variation in the amount of federal aid provided to different districts. And part of that was driven just by the Title I formula. So in this graph, I'm just reporting the vertical line here is how much Title I aid did a district in different states receive if there were 40% eligible students in that district. So in Tennessee, you received about $600 per student. And in New Hampshire, you received about $1,600 per student at that same poverty rate. It turns out the Title I formula, it really helps to be in a small state because under our federal system, every state gets the same amount of votes in the Senate. And so the small states really benefit from that. There's a minimum amount of Title I money that states receive. And if you're a small state, you end up getting a lot more money, especially if you're a poor district in those small states. So the allocation per child 5 to 17 is much steeper in the smaller states. So we're using this kind of variation in the amount of money that you receive, holding constant the poverty rate in the community to try to separate out what was the effect of the dollars versus what was the effect of the poverty. Here, this you can just show and notice along the x-axis is percent free lunch in 2019. The y-axis is ESSER, the federal pandemic relief per student. Notice it fans out as you move to higher poverty communities. Among the highest poverty group, so 80 to 100% for your reduced price lunch. The median district receives $6,000 per student, but the 90th percentile district received $10,000 per student, and the 10th percentile district received $3,600. Similarly, poor districts received wildly different amounts of federal aid driven by the Title I form. And actually, one thing I forgot to mention, just looking at this, is you might say, okay, that's a sizable difference, $1,000 between a 40% poor district in Tennessee versus New Hampshire. And, you know, that's $1,000, you know, per student or per child age 5 to 17. But under ESSER, that got multiplied by 10. So you ended up receiving about a $1,000 difference in Title I grant converted into a $10,000 difference per student in ESSER. It turns out, and the reason why this happened was Congress said, let's, you know, how are we going to distribute the pandemic relief dollars? Well, let's just use the Title I formula. But the total amount of federal pandemic relief was about $190 billion. The annual spending on Title I was about $18 billion. So what Congress effectively did was pushed $190 billion of aid through pipes that were previously carrying $18 billion. And so these differences that existed in the program because of political compromise, those little quirks got greatly exaggerated during the pandemic relief period, just because of the way the money was distributed. And for our purposes, that was fortunate because we saw similar districts receiving dramatically different amounts of money. Okay. Again, I've got a regression table, but why don't I just talk about it? Rather than go through it. So we find that, so controlling for a large number of different district characteristics, including very fine measures of the number of poor children. So we, in the district. So we're comparing districts that were within 2 percentage points on the percent of their students that were poor. We find that the districts that received more federal money did see somewhat faster growth between 22 and 24. The difference was about 0.005 standard deviations per $1,000 spent. It turns out that's about what the prior research suggested you would get from a general revenue increase. So there'd been a literature review by Bo Jackson and Rebecca Macavicius right before the pandemic, which said you get about that size impact for broad-based increases in revenue. So not targeted on particular interventions like tutoring or summer learning, you get, you know, many much larger impacts. But if you just you know, provide a general revenue increase, you get about 0.005 standard deviations per $1,000 increase per student. Now, that should not be surprising in the case of the pandemic relief because of just the few restrictions that were placed on districts in how they spent the money. So districts were only required to spend 20% on academic recovery. They could spend it on a wide range of things. And I'll show you in a second data on just how districts in Massachusetts spend it. But let me just say that the magnitude of the effects that we see are consistent with the proportion of the money that was spent on things like tutoring and after school and summer learning, that the kinds of things that research has shown have a positive effects on student achievement, as opposed to other things like HVAC or curriculum purchases or professional development, where the evidence is less clear. One other thing I just wanted to highlight is even though it's common sense that increases in absenteeism would be related to slowing the recovery, we actually see some more, you know, direct evidence of that by seeing among districts that were very similar in terms of poverty, percent of time remote during 2021, the amount of pandemic relief that they got and so forth. The districts where there were high chronic absenteeism rates between 22 and 24 saw somewhat slower growth.
Just a quick clarification. These estimates are using the allocation rules that you were telling us about. Those are so-
Yes,
so-
yeah.
So they're like an instrument.
Yes, yeah. Okay. We also had more detailed data on how districts spent the money from California. And we saw somewhat larger effects so nationally, we didn't have data on how much districts were actually spending on after school, summer learning, those kinds of things. There had been separate research on that, but in California, we could see how much were districts spending on those kinds of academic interventions. And in California, we saw that actually there were much larger effects for districts that spent more money on those kinds of interventions. Okay. If we just say, all right, we take our estimate of what was the effect of dollars spent by the federal government and multiply it by the amount of money districts received, we could explain most of the increase most of the improvement for the highest poverty district. So here, this light gray line is the actual loss as of spring 22. So the highest poverty districts lost a little bit more than 0.2 standard deviations. The lowest poverty districts lost about 0.1 standard deviations. The dark gray line is where they stood as of 2024. And you see, at least in math, there was something of a recovery. And the amount of recovery was about what we would have predicted for the highest poverty districts. The higher income districts also saw recovery, even though they received very little federal money. Clearly, there were other things going on, whether it was social capital or parents getting their kids to read, or other things happening in the higher income. But it would seem that the aid prevented what would have been even larger losses in the highest poverty communities. Now, here are data by town here in Massachusetts. This is is there any way to move that?
Yes.
Okay, so sorry, I maximized the size of the graph, and to make it easier to see all these individual data points. But so this is just showing the change in math achievement between 2019 and 2024. That's on the vertical axis, and on the horizontal axis is percent free or reduced price lunch. Here you can see Lexington, Brookline, Newton, but the higher income suburbs are either back in the case of Lexington, or close to back in the case of the other higher income communities to where they were in 2019 in math. That the net change is close to zero in these communities. Now, among the higher poverty communities, the purple line is just the estimated regression line. Among the average high poverty community, there were bigger losses, but notice there's also more spread that you see Lynn, where there's been a 2 grade equivalent loss, had much larger losses than Boston and Springfield, even though Boston and Springfield had bigger losses than Newton and Brookline. So a lot of variability among the high poverty districts, and just in terms of the magnitude of the achievement loss.
Just quick question. So, that slide is about the difference between 2019 and 2024 in those
Yes.
districts.
Yes,
So if you were to look at more of a snapshot of where they are just, relative to one another in
Yeah.
nominal test
Yeah.
scores, it might be a lot closer. In other words, like potentially Springfield started from a lower base and therefore at a smaller
yeah, you mean,
drop and whatever.
like these guys would be closer on the.
But in other words, this isn't a snapshot of kind of where they are relative to each other. It's where they are relative to the change in that.
It's relative to where they were
Where they individually were.
in
Yeah, okay.
2019. And so what this is saying is, so we're not, this is an important clarification. With this, we're not saying higher poverty communities are lower achieving. That was true before the pandemic, it's true now. What we're saying is that those differences are larger now than they were before the pandemic. The size of just the number of students, the size of the district. So Boston being the biggest, these circles, the gray ones, so we're only calling out the names of, I think, the largest 30, districts. The uncolored dots are the small districts that we just couldn't fill up the whole graph with labels on every one of the dots. But you can see because they're small, they're mostly small districts. Yes, Antonio.
Just curious if you know some of the top gray spots. The
Yeah.
Name of the towns.
So actually, this one is Cambridge. I don't know the names of all these towns, although if you go to the Education Recovery Scorecard website, if you have a particular district you're interested in, that graph I showed for Lynn at the beginning, we have a similar graph like that for, most districts in Massachusetts.
Are there any hypotheses for Framingham and Gwen?
So, that's not the point of this talk, but I know part of the decline is related to there seems to have been an increase in the number of English language learners in those districts. But you notice my hedging because I think people point to that as a reason to ignore the fact that, well, okay, that explains all of the loss. It doesn't explain all of the loss, that much of even if you just look at white students or if you look within subgroups, there were substantial losses. Okay, that was math. This is reading, similar sort of pattern. Lynn, 2 grade equivalents back behind. Lexington back above, the higher income districts close to back above.
I'm struck that the focus is on large demographic units, a whole district, and comparing districts to districts. I think it is possible that the best successes are school by school, and they disappear when looking at whole districts. So my frustration, I'm a former principal, is that the 3 schools that you mentioned at the very beginning that got a mention, okay, it was only a mention, and we don't know, we here in the room don't know what they did that made them positive outliers.
Yeah.
So I just want to push against always it being about the demographics.
Well, we're not always being about the demographics. We're so we have to zoom out to this level to try to answer a question like, to what extent did chronic absenteeism play a role in slowing the recovery? To what extent did the federal pandemic dollars help or not? So I agree for saying, actually, for answering the question of what worked, did a particular tutoring program, is that why somebody improved? you would need large numbers of, because if you just look at one place that has tried that one thing, you might be fooled into thinking, well, that was the reason. You have to zoom out to say, okay, what were all the schools that tried tutoring programs, and on average, did they improve more? Are we right to attribute the improvement in a particular place to the
I'll just
particular
push back a
thing?
little. But if we looked at those 3 schools that you mentioned
I don't
at
think
the very beginning,
So let's, why don't we just hold that until the end? Let's make sure we can get through the
okay,
presentation.
Okay, so here's the district level changes in absence rates. Higher increases for the higher poverty districts. So for this presentation, I just focused on Massachusetts. If you go to the Education Recovery Scorecard, you see that while there are some other states that have a very similar pattern to ours, thinking Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania have a similar pattern to what we see. There were other states where the gaps did not widen nearly as much. And they may be some surprising states like Alabama, like Louisiana. And so while this pattern was common, we weren't unique in this. We were among the states with the widest widening in achievement gaps between high and low poverty districts. Okay, now here is some very fresh data that we got just last weekend that I've started to analyze on just how districts spent the money, at least as of spring 23. There were recently released data from the U.S. Department of Education, actually was one of the last data releases that have come out of the department maybe for a while. But I've just been analyzing them, and so this just shows in Massachusetts, this is total ESSER grant per student. So districts like Boston and Springfield received about $10,000 per student in federal pandemic relief. Other similarly poor districts like Everett, Brockton also received a substantial amount of money, but more like $4,000 per student. In terms of how did they spend it? Well,
Sorry, Tom, just a
yeah.
quick question. Is allocated, you had allocated and then remaining.
Yeah.
So is the difference between them what they actually spent?
Yeah,
Okay.
and I'll be talking.
Okay.
So how did they spend it so far, at least? So relatively few districts spent substantial amounts on the things that students needed in terms of catching up. So Lowell is one place that spent about $500 out of so the average district in a poverty rate like this received about $6,000 per student. Lowell spent a little over $500 per student on things like tutoring, after school, and summer learning, providing the supplemental instruction to help students catch up. But most districts, including Lynn, spent much less than that, spent less than $100 per student on the types of things that would help students catch up. If you look at like spending on anything categorized as academic, Lynn spent less than $500 per student as of 2023. Lynn, though, was an outlier in terms of how much they spend on HVAC and school building renovation, which was closer to $750 per student. If you look just at the average among all the Massachusetts districts with greater than 70% free reduced price lunch, The amount they'd spent so far was about $3,000 per student. They had another about $3,600 left over still to be spent as of July 2023. But then when we look at the averages, about $300 on professional development or curriculum purchases, a similar amount on HVAC and buildings. Less than $200, more like $150 on things like tutoring, summer, after school, which was similar to the amount spent on Wi-Fi and hardware. Sort of discouraging, actually, for those of us who've been trying to say that students need extra learning time in order to catch up. Yes.
The HVAC, though, I would assume is not putting air conditioners in the principal's office, but rather ventilation. in the
Yes.
classroom.
Yes, so some of this would be for public health purposes, preparing for, another pandemic. And actually, that's part of the reason why the American Rescue Plan provided so much flexibility and had so few restrictions on how the money could be spent. So in March of 2021, when the American Rescue Plan passed, schools were still closed in a lot of places. And we had no idea what the magnitude of achievement loss was going to be. In fact, I think most parents by that point knew that, in-person schooling was better than what students were getting outside of school, at least on average. But nobody knew how big the achievement losses would be. And so when Congress passed the plan, they put in this 20% minimum spending on academic, figuring, okay, well, we don't know how big the achievement losses are going to be, but we want to make sure people spend some of it on academic. And unfortunately, some districts took that as a suggestion rather than a minimum, and spent something close to 20-some% on academic interventions to help students catch up. Where in some districts like Lynn, they would have had to spend all of it on academic recovery in order for students to catch up.
In terms of capacity, what capacity was there to do academic
Yeah.
interventions?
So that actually is a great question, because we've had some other projects during this period where we were working with individual districts to help them evaluate the impact of their tutoring program or their summer learning program or other things like that. So we'd had a bunch of conversations with these local officials running these things. And the thing that has been striking is that the binding constraint, at least during these last 2 or 3 years, have not been dollars. The binding constraint has been management capacity to plan major initiatives. So think about it. If you were already struggling to launch a successful school year, especially in the fall of 2021 or the fall of 2022, having to recruit teachers, having to recruit bus drivers, and so forth, having to plan on top of a normal school year, major tutoring effort, a major summer learning, like doubling, tripling your summer learning, programs. That was just beyond the reach of many districts, not all. We saw in the data, there were some districts that realized that the only way students were going to catch up is if they invested heavily in these kinds of things. And we publish on the Education Recovery Scorecard here 106 districts, nationally that have seen substantial recovery since 2019.
So Tom, I want to make sure you have enough time to
Yeah,
get
sorry.
through. So I don't know how many you've got left, but
So.
Plow forward.
So I've just got a couple more left and then I'll open up for discussion. So one of the questions is, okay, well, what were districts spending the money on? And a lot of it went towards hiring. So this is just reporting by the same, percent free lunch. What was the number of FTE staff in fall of 23 versus fall of 2019? So right before the pandemic. And some districts, Lynn has seen a more than 20% increase in the number of FTE staff. Chelsea, similar. Fall River, more than 40% increase. The higher income districts have, some have increased a little bit, some have decreased a little bit in terms of FTE. But a big chunk of the federal pandemic recovery went to paying for hiring people rather than other kinds of efforts. So why don't I just shift to talk about policy implications? Yes.
Could you qualify instructional staff, paraprofessionals?
So
administrative staff?
In these data that we have, we can't do that, although obviously we would love to. And eventually, well, if there is a common core of data in the future, we might be able to do that sort of thing. Yeah. Okay, but the data we have now, as part of the ESSER reporting, districts were just required to report how many FTE positions did you have as of the end of September, each of the recent years. Okay, so the federal money expired at the end of September. And obviously lots of students are still behind. So what should be our focus now? We emphasize like 4 things. Number one, we just recommend that, evidence from before the pandemic and during the pandemic suggests that high dosage tutoring, summer learning, efforts to increase the amount of instructional time students are receiving do have positive effects on average on student achievement. And so even though the federal pandemic relief has expired, you're saying, okay, especially in the districts that remain behind, states and districts should be required to, or should be focusing on academic catch up, those kinds of academic catch up efforts. One very concrete thing that states could do is under the Every Student Succeeds Act, states are allowed to set aside 3% of the Title I dollars for direct student services like tutoring, where the state is reserving dollars that can go directly to students. Only one state exercises that authority right now, and that's Ohio. So that is one thing where the state again would be taking 3% out of the district allocations and putting it directly towards tutoring. That's one way to ensure that the dollars go to tutoring. Another thing that states could do is they also have 7% of the Title I dollars for school improvement efforts, and they could be targeting those dollars towards things instead of putting them through the formula and distributing to districts, earmarking them for things like summer learning, tutoring, other interventions that have been shown to be effective. A second thing is we just call for a community-wide effort to try to lower absenteeism. Actually, when you think about it, absenteeism is one of the very few things that organizations outside of schools could actually help schools with now. So most, mayors can't teach Algebra 1, but a mayor could do a, public information campaign. Employers could be giving, parents more flexibility around school pickup and drop off. times. Community organizations like, museums or even sports teams could be sponsoring extracurricular activities at schools to help draw students in. Parents could be volunteering to show up on the school steps in the morning to, welcome students to school, to make students and families feel even better about showing up. So students are not going to catch up if absence rates remain elevated. And we somehow have to work collectively to lower those. A third thing is, since the beginning of the pandemic, there have been a number of polls that suggest that parents underestimate just the impact on their students' achievement. There was a Education Next did a poll in the fall of 2022, where I think it was 9% of parents were either concerned or very concerned that their child had fallen behind and will struggle to catch up. Many parents perceive that either their child didn't lose any ground, or that the ground they lost, it would be easy to catch up from. And now the reason why that's important is that if parents think everything is okay, they may not sign up for summer learning. They may resist efforts to increase the length of the school year. In Richmond, Virginia, which saw losses similar to Lynn, the superintendent there, a Harvard grad, Jason Cameras, was proposing to extend the school year, even while schools were still closed, was saying students are going to be way behind when we get back. We're going to have to add a couple of weeks to the school year. He was voted down twice by the school board, eventually got some increases, a couple of week increase in a few schools, but not the district-wide effort he was seeking. So parents are going to resist or won't sign up for things. They may resist. They won't ask for a tutor. They may not be as concerned as they should be when absenteeism is higher. So one way to change that would be to have teachers inform parents in the spring. Teachers, not some anonymous letter in the mail. Teachers inform parents when their child is below grade level in math or English. Inform in the springs in time for parents to sign up for summer learning. And then a fourth thing is clearly we should be using this time now to figure out what's working and what's not in the recent literacy reforms. So I didn't mention this, but actually, while we saw some recovery in math, literacy scores continued to decline between 22 and 24. So students were doing the opposite of catching up between 22 and 24. So it's clear that there's something going on that wasn't just driven by what happened or didn't happen during the 2021 school year. 40 different states, including our own, have launched some kind of science reading initiative. Clearly, not all of them are working. We've got to figure out which subset of policies are making a difference and aren't. Similarly, there have been a lot of districts that have been experimenting with cell phone bans, which may be helpful, maybe not, including a bunch here in Massachusetts. So we don't have a decade to just let the research literature figure out whether cell phone bans work or not. We need a concerted effort to try to answer some of these things, and we're starting a project called States Leading States, where we're going to be working with a set of states to help them evaluate these kinds of interventions. All right, why don't I stop there? We got at least a few.
Yeah, no, this is great.
Questions.
And we can, depending on your time, we can go past one, and hopefully people can stay. Well, I'll kick off one question and then let's open it up to the floor here. And so this may be a loaded question, given the timing, but given the urgency of the problem, and I think the list of good, ideas that you've suggested here as policy, approaches, I'm wondering if focusing on the 3% set aside or the 7% school improvement funds is quite big enough a shift. And so this gets to the question that's been put on the table really by the Trump administration around block granting Title I, and essentially giving states the authority to make these decisions, not just at the margins, but potentially at a much larger level. And I'm not necessarily suggesting you weigh in on that question, but in terms of the balance of power between states and districts, do you think we need to reorient more towards the states in order to ensure that we're given the right resources and urgency?
So we just ran a big experiment where the money went directly to districts. 90% of the federal pandemic relief went directly to districts, with states having very little authority to approve or disapprove any district plan. And some districts figured out how to spend the money well, but most didn't. So I think I do think states can play a critical role in a couple of ways. One, like here in Massachusetts, the Student Opportunity Act. Districts ought to be required to describe not just what they're planning to do, but why what they're planning to do will be sufficient to help students recover. So this has been missing throughout the last couple of years, is anybody doing the math on their plans, like describing the share of students they're going to provide tutors to, and then multiply that by the research on what's the effect of high dosage tutoring. Describe what percentage of students are going to summer learning, and then what's the effect of summer learning on achievement. If districts are going to say, okay, we're going to spend all this money on professional development, that's going to help students. Well, show me the study, where the dollars per student spent on professional development generated, the magnitude of improvement that your students need. Like, so asking districts not just to say what they're doing, but how they could justify, even on paper, that what they're doing would be enough to help students catch up. I think it is something states really are going to have to do. Like, and some southern states have been doing. Like, so Alabama, the reason why Birmingham is back, almost above where they were in 2019, despite being a high poverty district, is, they spent a lot of the money on tutoring and math coaches, and the state provided money for math coaches. So we need more state leadership. It can't just be passed down to local communities and expect, great things to happen.
Yeah, Tom, I'd love to give you an opportunity that I know you're very enthusiastic about, to praise either at the micro level, a town or even an individual school.
Yeah.
Or at the more macro level, a state.
Yeah.
In other words, are there one or two states that you can really say something nice that, more than just Alabama cares, but,
So,
why don't you praise someone?
yeah. So I was just talking about Birmingham. So
Yeah.
Birmingham is a high poverty community, not a wealthy community by any. I think percent free or reduced price lunch is 85, 90%. Mark Sullivan, the superintendent there, has been focused on tutoring, hiring math coaches, so forth. Birmingham is almost back above 2019 levels in both math and reading. Compton, California is almost back to where they were in 2019, despite having long periods of closure during the 2021 school year. Los Angeles Unified School District is close to back in both math and reading. So there are a number of districts that have done fairly well. Even Cambridge here in Massachusetts is like, they were the highest poverty district that was back close to 2019 levels. There were some wealthier districts that are doing better than them relative to 2019. But and so like this data make it possible to find those kinds of outliers, and we can't infer from those data that the things they said they did were the cause, like that's a source of hypotheses about like what are the things that make a difference, and then we could use the aggregate data to figure out if that was true on average or whether whether the things that the districts think made the difference seem to have made a difference nationally. Yes.
Why don't we conceptualize, say, a 0.1 decrease in math achievement over a period of time in terms of realized outcomes on student performance?
Oh, great question.
Graduation rate, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So in my colleague Doug Steger and I did a study recently where we looked at the children born in states that saw big run-ups in the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Massachusetts was one, but like North Carolina was another. And we said, okay, let's look at the long-term outcomes for the people born in those states versus the change in long-term outcomes for the people born in states with much smaller increases during that period. And we saw in states this, with increases in NAEP score, increases in earnings, increases in educational attainment, declines in arrest rates, declines in teen motherhood rates. And all of that is just consistent with the cross-sectional literature on what's the relationship between test scores and those kinds of outcomes. So we know that that these declines are likely to have longer term implications on people's careers. A 0.1 a standard deviation loss in achievement would generate about a 0.001 decline in lifetime, or a 0.1% decline in lifetime earnings, which, when you multiply by lifetime earnings, is a big number. We initially estimated that the impact on lifetime earnings from the initial loss as of 2022 was about $900 billion. Other people came up with much larger estimates. So I think Rick Hanushek has an estimate something like 38 trillion or something like that. So it's a big loss for the economy if students don't recover. And we've already had I guess 5 now graduating classes graduates since so spring of 2020 through the spring of 24. So that's about 15 million people that are out in the labor market now that are beyond K-12. So that have already paid some of the price.
And Michael, is there an online question? All right, more for us.
Yes.
We're told that there'll be another pandemic. There's measles, et cetera, et cetera. There's the problem of undocumented students who are not going to school. And clearly schools will be gun shy about shutting down if there's another disaster. But how are schools, or how should schools prepare to be more ready to deal with the problems of some kind of a catastrophe? And it seems to me that only putting the burden on students, stay in school longer, stay a longer day, longer year, come in the summer, miss vacations, is not an adequate solution. And no one's talking about curricular reform.
Yeah. So a couple of things. One, so obviously different communities made different decisions in the fall of 2020. And there was a huge amount of uncertainty about what the right decision was. But in whether we agreed with them or not, our duly elected or duly appointed officials made decisions about school closures during 2021, and some decided to reopen quickly, and others schools stayed closed for longer. Just given the uncertainty at the time, it's hard to fault anybody. There have been people who've been arguing since then that the evidence was that the effect of school closures on infections was not large. So I'm not going to wade into that, but it just meant that the communities that did decide to stay closed for longer had more work to do to help students catch up. Instead, what we have done here in Massachusetts, what we have done is we have decided to make poor kids pay the price for the public health measures that were taken on all of our behalf. Like the school closures were not primarily about protecting children's health. The school closures were about, protecting the health of me and, other folks with white hair. And so it's ironic now that we're just sort of, saying, well, I guess that's too bad for the kids, without remembering, okay, what was the reason for the school closures to begin with? And isn't it unjust that we're asking children to pay the price? Now, I think if there were some way we could get people to learn without having more instructional time, that would be great. But the problem is, people have just forgotten just the basic physics of instruction. And that is, it takes a certain amount of time to explain the Pythagorean theorem, or to, teach somebody to add fractions with unlike denominators. Like, teachers can't just talk faster. It's maybe, of course, we can come up with more efficient ways to describe it, but that will take time. Like, they're in the districts that lost a grade equivalent, students would have had to learn 150% of what they would typically learn 2 years in a row. It's really hard to do that without more time. Like, what other industry do we have like a 50% increase in productivity in 1 year? So that's
What if we decided at the time being we're not going to teach adding fractions with unequal denominators? We'll give kids technology to do it, and then we'll go forward from there.
Well, so it's not just being able to add unlike fractions with unlike denominators. It's about all the things that knowing how to do that helps you learn later. So it's not just about the specific math skills. It's about all the other skills in science and engineering and so forth that having those basic math skills lets you do.
Yeah, we use technology more. And
so we could, but it's just that we could. Although one of the things we learned during the pandemic was just the importance of personal interaction for children's learning. So I'm not saying that there isn't the promise of technological solutions that increase productivity, but we have to be realistic about what's gonna, like, in the real economy, you see 1%, 2%, 3% increase in real productivity would be, dramatic. And so a 50% increase in productivity per time that's almost impossible. So that's where I mean, it's sort of defying the laws of physics. So yes, we can get some of it out of increase in productivity of time spent, but I think there's no way to get there without having some increase in instructional time. Instead, just the opposite. We've been doing the opposite. Absence rates have increased. And actually, the thing with absences is there have been a number of studies that show, obviously, the kids who are absent are losing time. So I miss a day, I obviously miss that day, but my first day back, I only understand 85% of what the teacher is saying, so I lose 0.15 on another day, and then, the next day, maybe I'm getting 90%, but I'm still lost another 10% of a day. But when the absent students come back into the classroom and the teacher's having to reteach, and there's a constant flow of different kids that were absent, that slows down learning for everybody. And that's part, I think, of what we're seeing.
So I think we're about out of time. One quick comment or observation is the sort of public opinion part of this, and in particular, being honest with parents about student performance. I think one of the challenges, not solely as a result of COVID, but deepened as a result of COVID, is how folks, including educators, have sort of reached a conclusion that traditional measures of academic achievement are actually no longer as relevant as they used to be. And that could just be convenient kind of excuse making, or it could be kind of a shift in overall perceptions about the value of school and academic achievement, sort of relating to, do you need to know how to add, fractions of unlike denominators?
Yes, you do.
Well, no, but
Yeah.
the public view
Yes.
and I think increasingly within the educational, for lack of a better word, establishment, is that we ought to be focusing more on behavioral health and social emotional development and other things like that. And those aren't necessarily zero-sum games, but they tend to play out that way. And certainly in terms of the way parents and teachers sort of think about, how's my child doing? Well,
Yeah.
How they're doing on MCAS actually isn't very important.
Yeah.
Which makes it hard to
Yeah.
re-engage people.
It isn't very important in the short term, but it is very important in the long term.
All right, I think we need to be done. Thank you, Tom. That was really terrific. Really appreciate it. Thanks everybody for coming.